And we'll be advancing to the next slide. I'd like to welcome everybody to the State Trail Advisory Committee meeting, our fall meeting. My name is Jennifer Wampler. I'm the Trails Coordinator with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. Just a little housekeeping. I think most of you guys are on mute, but if you're not, just place yourself on mute so that we don't have interference. If you have comments and questions, please enter those in the chat box. Lynn Crump is monitoring the chat box for me. And then we also record all of those and record and add those to the notes. This presentation will be available online following the meeting. If you don't have a chance to say what you want to say today, please email me. My contact information is there, and Lynn is also going to put it in the chat bar. So the purpose of this meeting, the State Trails Advisory Committee was formed to assist DCR in implementing a sustainable, attractive, and enduring trails for the use and enjoyment of citizens. If you can, please enter your...
Jennifer, we cannot hear you.
I can hear her fine.
Is there anybody besides Kelly who cannot hear me?
Jennifer.
Clyde, can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you loud and clear.
Kelly, I think that might be a problem on your end. Can everybody enter your name? And
I think Jennifer is having technical difficulties. Can everybody hear me?
Kelly, I can hear both you and Jennifer. And I see a beautiful picture of a horse.
so I am going to move forward with the agenda. We have on the line Kelly McClary, who's the Director of Planning and Recreation Resources, Tom Smith, who's the Deputy Director of Operations, and Nathan Burrell, Deputy Director of Government and Community Affairs. And we have Kelly here, who's going to talk a little bit about the Shenandoah Rail Trail feasibility study.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to welcome everyone to the Statewide Trails Advisory Committee today. I appreciate everyone coming online today. Unfortunately, we're still online, maybe for a couple more months. Hopefully the next time we have one of these meetings, we can be in person, maybe sometime next year. I wanted to give everybody an update of the Shenandoah Rail Trail feasibility study. We are finishing and putting those last edits on that study. It's due, as you guys know, November 1st. We spoke about this study on the last Statewide Trails Advisory Committee. Jennifer and partners have done a fantastic job at this point in time. We have a complete study. It's in the last edits, and it will soon go to the Secretary's office once our director has the final approval. And at some point in time, it will be live online. And when that occurs, we'll let this committee know so that you can find that and track that as well. Also, at this point in time, what I wanted to do is introduce Tom Smith, and this will probably be the last committee meeting that he attends. He's sitting in for Clyde Chrisman today. But I also want to recognize Tom because he has worked. He is retiring this year, and he's retiring as of the 1st of January. And like I said, he will probably be the last committee meeting that he attends. But I also want to recognize him for his years of service, both with DCR as far as for the state of Virginia as well as Pennsylvania. He has, I believe, over 40 years, and I'll let Tom correct me, but I believe it's over 40 years of state service between Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I did want to recognize his efforts and congratulate him on his retirement. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over for Tom to have some remarks.
Tom, you might be
Tom, I
muted.
cannot hear you.
I've lost track of the number of months we've been in the pandemic, but I still have trouble, like many of us do, clicking off the mute button. Thanks, guys. Appreciate everybody being here this afternoon. It's a big crowd, and as we have continued to see over the past several years, the interest in trails just continues to grow, explode across the state, and that's a really exciting opportunity for us at DCR and everybody out there. Definitely a good thing. So thanks, Kelly, for the acknowledgement. Yes, I'm set to retire on January 1, taking most of December off, but I've been here at DCR for 31 years, and it's been an amazing 31 years in Virginia, and super thrilled about all the great conservation work that we've been able to get accomplished over that period of time. Clyde Chrisman, our director, who's you heard there at the beginning, and is present with us. Clyde announced my replacement yesterday to the agency, and that is Frank Stovall. Some of you might know him. He is currently with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Previously did some work in state parks in South Carolina and also served as the town manager down there. So I think we are really excited about seeing Frank moving over to the DCR team. And he's somebody that, if you don't know him, I think you will enjoy getting to know and work with here in future years. We also had some other sort of recent changes at DCR leadership. So Russ Baxter, who has been the Deputy Director for Dam Safety, Floodplain Management, and Soil and Water Conservation, recently retired. And Daryl Glover, who some of you may know, has replaced Russ in that Deputy Director role. I would also encourage those of you that want to see some other changes that are happening to check out DCR's jobs website. We've got a number of really interesting positions that are open right now at DCR. The Heritage Program has a number of positions.
You're fine. If you want to bring them in, Ace will take care of you.
Okay, where do you want
Jesse, you can just bring them right in.
Somebody could mute their line, please. So we got a number of interesting field biologist positions within the Natural Heritage Program, a Natural Areas Operations Steward. Kelly's division, Planning and Recreation Resources, has a Chief Environmental Planner position that is open, and the Division of State Parks has a GIS database manager and a Natural and Cultural Resource Manager position that are open, and in addition to a number of other park openings. So just encourage you to check out those pages. So I think I'll wrap it up there, and thank you, Kelly.
And is Nathan going to speak today?
Yes, I see Nathan here, and sorry, I should have rolled on over. So Nathan Burrell is our Deputy Director of Government Relations, and is going to share a few words about the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives within the agency.
Yes, thank you guys for having me here, and for being steadfast in assisting our agency and as we plan and develop statewide trails. As you heard from Tom, a lot of changes are happening within DCR. Some of those changes really are starting to reflect our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. As you guys are aware, every state agency at this point is responsible for not only developing a diversity, equity, inclusion plan, but also maintaining that plan, meaning they need to update that plan annually and provide reports related to the activities that have taken place related to that plan. So there's metrics, goals, and feet being held to the fire related to these efforts. We've updated our plan. We've updated our plan the second time, actually. So we're well into our 2021, 2022 strategic plan related to diversity, equity, inclusion. And again, as some of you are aware, this effort is a holistic effort that really focuses both internally within the agency, but also externally How do we connect to the community? How do we partner with communities? And how do we really get further upstream to really raise the tide of diversity within the outdoors and natural resource management. I'm going to give you guys a few high-level highlights related to some of the work that you all are doing. One that we've been hearing a lot about is mapping. You guys are probably well aware of our efforts around Conserve Virginia, which has just been updated to 3.0. But also, we've been partnering with our friends at DEQ in their EJ office, where we've been able to receive an environmental justice grant from the EPA that will develop a statewide environmental justice map. So we'll have a statewide specific EJ mapping tool. And within that mapping tool, we'll have a layer that is specifically related to outdoor access, equitable outdoor access. We're starting to tie this into our VOP and planning efforts there as well. So we're really excited about that effort. Our state parks are really working to retell the story of the lands that we manage. This effort is really culminated in development of a scope related to engaging HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, as well as community colleges across our state. Looking at hiring individuals, stipends, if you will, to bring in college students of diverse backgrounds into these spaces that we manage, really start to dig into the stories of the land and really put a different lens on it. So we're really excited about that effort as well. We've put in a budget request this year for this effort and continue to seek other funding related to it. And also VLCF. Many of you guys on this call have probably applied for a VLCF grant here recently. You notice within the requirements of scoring criteria change. That change has really started to move us towards pushing development projects and infrastructure related to the outdoors in the underserved communities. So there's now been a scoring criteria related to underserved communities where you need to identify your project area that is reviewed against a mapping tool, VIM's mapping tool at this point. For social vulnerability communities get an extra points within VLCF at this juncture. And what we're seeing is that communities and projects that are either adjacent or within these socially vulnerable communities, we're now seeing where they're starting to get funding and scoring higher within our rankings. And so, we're very happy to say that, some of these changes and tweaks that we've been making to our grant scoring criteria and really thinking again, holistically about our approach to land conservation and natural resource management has really led us to a point where we're able to make these tweaks and see changes in how we are able to dole out funds to communities that traditionally haven't gotten these funds or had access to them. So these are just some of the major highlights. There's many, many other things happening within our agency related to diversity, equity, inclusion. But I think there's a few that are near and dear to this group.
Thank you, Nathan. If we have time at the end, we'll go over some of the ways in which we've tried to diversify this committee. There's still quite a bit of work to be done on that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to head on into the next presentation. We have Emily Stott, the Chief of Rail Transportation at the Division of Rail and Public Transportation, Department of Rail and Public Transportation. So Emily, you want to take it?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. And I think I just turned on my camera. Is it going? Maybe not.
Oh, do you want to show your camera? I've got your slide screen up. I can just advance for you.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. That sounds great. Thank you. So yes, I am Emily Stock. I'm with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. And thanks for inviting me today. I'm going to be talking about the statewide rail plan. And that is a plan that our agency takes on every 4 years. It's a
I think we just lost Emily. So while she's coming back on, I'm going to go over some of the new members of the State Trails Advisory Committee. As I mentioned, I think last spring, we've invited Jody Shiflett with the Paralyzed Veterans of America and Victoria Ferguson with the Monacan Nation. Also joining us, Jeff Monroe, who is the Associate Director of the Institution Review Board for Social and Behavioral Sciences at UVA, and also Supervisor of Membership at the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. Also, as you know, Liz Belcher retired, which was a great loss to the trails community, but Frank McGuire has taken her place. He's Program Director for Trails and Outdoor Recreation with the Pennsylvania Environmental Council and Regional Director, and these are former jobs, Regional Director of the International Mountain Bicycling Association. He also founded a trail consulting firm that did hand crew training and trail design. So lots of great experience that he's bringing to the Roanoke region. Also, Timothy Hupp has replaced Tom Johnson as the Great Eastern Trail Association rep, and Brantley Tyndall is on representing Virginia Bicycling Federation and Bike Walk RVA. Emily, are you back with us?
I am. Sorry about that.
Go right ahead.
You're ready for me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's try this again. Take 2. And I'm not seeing the presentation up quite yet, but it may be that there's a delay on my screen.
Is nobody seeing the presentation?
I see it. Fine.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead then. I'm on slide number 2 at this point.
Yes.
Of the presentation on the statewide rail plan. I'll talk a little bit about my agency, DRPT, as we're known. This is the mission of the agency. I'm not going to read through it, but our focus is the movement of people and goods throughout the Commonwealth. And our primary areas of activity are rail, public transportation, and commuter service. The rail division that I represent administers what's called the Rail Industrial Access and Rail Preservation Grants for last mile freight rail connections that divert truck traffic from the road to rail. And DRPT has a commitment to supporting mode shift for passenger and freight, which helps our bottom line as a state in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and is a great value to Virginia to maximize the utility of existing rail lines. So while we're not trail planners per se, we do have a role to facilitate between trail planners and railroads at railroad crossings per HB 2088, for those of you all who are familiar. So that's how I've gotten to know Jennifer Wampler. And of course, as the rail industry has changed over the years, there have been a number of abandonments, and there have been opportunities for rails to trails. So there's definitely a nexus there. Next slide, slide number 3. We recently spun off an agency called the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, the VPRA. It was formed to implement passenger rail projects and manage rail property that the Commonwealth will acquire as part of recent agreements with freight railroads. And they'll be maintaining and developing passenger rail service in partnership with VRE and Amtrak. And DRPT, according to this chart, as you can see on this chart, does retain our statewide planning and environmental functions, including the statewide rail plan and freight programs functions. And slide number 4, plan development process. Right now, we are in the process of working with railroads to develop a long range and medium range draft project list. And we'll be working on service development planning and actually adopting the final plan in the spring of 2022. Our plan overview, the plan aligns with the goals and objectives of VTrans, which is the statewide transportation plan that incorporates all modes. And Virginia's last statewide rail plan was adopted by the Commonwealth Transportation Board in 2018. As I mentioned, this is a requirement by the Federal Railroad Administration. It's necessary for our applications for federal funding for rail projects. And we do coordinate very closely with the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, and we have the same goals as VTrans, which are listed here on the right-hand side. So next slide, number 6. So I've gone through some of the basics, but one thing that's new this year that's a big focus for us is policy development. I mentioned how VPRA is a new agency that recently started up, and now that the Commonwealth will be owning some rail infrastructure, there are opportunities for us to develop policies that we can implement through VPRA. And so we are really focusing on policy development in this rail plan, updating existing policies about stations, developing new policies, and aligning our policies with existing guardrails, existing legislation, and other precedent-setting actions that we can lean on as to guide our policies going forward as we make decisions about rail in Virginia. Next slide. So we're touching on a number of policies. Climate change policy and equity policy are naturals for us this year, and we've talked to the Commonwealth Transportation Board Rail and Transit Subcommittee about those recently. We also have a number of other policies that are here that are listed, and one that I want to bring to your attention that I know is of interest to this group falls under economic development, and that is a rail trail policy. And we chose, it could fit under a lot of different categories, but economic development seemed like the most natural fit because on one side of economic development, we deal with freight, and we want to promote freight and mode shift from trucks to rail in order to lower our statewide greenhouse gas emissions. But then we also understand preserving abandoned rail lines for transportation use, including trail use, and eventually, if the market changes, possibly rail use again. So that's something that we haven't spelled out before, and we'd like to be able to. This is a good opportunity for us to do so because of the changing nature of the railroads these days due to market forces, and also the interest in trails. So we are doing our research right now about all the different policies that I had on that list. Policy direction is something that we'll be working with our partners on, but there is a lot. Steps 1 through 5 all really relate to research and getting feedback from folks. Next slide. And for those of you all who are interested, this is the landscape of some of the changes in Virginia. This is slide 9, related to transforming rail in Virginia, which is a program that our agency is partnering on with railroads, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and also Virginia Railway Express and Amtrak. And the Commonwealth of Virginia, through VPRA, is going to be acquiring some of the right-of-way between the banks of the Potomac River, between Long Bridge and North Carolina, so that we can separate freight and passenger rail along that corridor, and also acquiring the Buckingham Branch Railroad between Doswell and Clifton Forge. We're adding service in the western corridor between Alexandria and down to New River Valley, where we'll eventually add some rail service. And of course, we in the Hampton Roads region, adding service to Norfolk and to Newport News is part of this initiative. And one of the things that we stress as we work with Amtrak is we do want stations and trains to be accessible by bicycles and pedestrians, and I know access to trails is really important as people do trips by rail to get to trails like the Capitol Trail in Richmond that's so close to the train station. So bikes on trains is something that that we definitely support and want to continue. And we are developing a map of studied rails to trails and abandoned rail in Virginia where there may be opportunities. So this is a draft map that we got from some of our partners, but we're looking at this. The folks at the CTB Rail and Transit Subcommittee are interested in this as well. So we do have, as I mentioned, have a commitment to supporting mode shift for passenger and freight from automobiles and trucks to railways. That helps our bottom line with greenhouse gas emissions, but we also understand the changing nature of the rail industry and want to support trails and transportation use in those corridors as time goes on. So I'm excited to continue working with Jennifer Wampler and other partner agencies on this team. And I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Emily. That was a great overview. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Christopher Dallas with the community planner with the Federal Highway Administration, and Jared. Jared, I think I'll let you introduce yourself rather than destroy your name here, from the Volpe Center. You guys want to take it on? And just tell us in advance.
All right, I'll start. Thank you, Jennifer. Christopher Dawes here, Federal Highway Administration. In normal times, I'm in Washington, D.C., but right now I'm in beautiful Fairfax City. So Jared Fijalkowski is with the US DOT Volpe Center. He's probably getting the rain that we got yesterday. He's in Massachusetts. Today, we're going to talk about rails with trails, which is very consistent with the presentation that we just heard. This report that we just issued we posted it in June. It describes effective practices to plan, design, construct, operate, and maintain rails with trails facilities. It describes methods to ensure railroad and trail safety and security, promote active transportation, promote health and wellness, support network connectivity and economic development, and enhance the environment, and all other kinds of good things. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what we're going to describe is, I'll give you an introduction from the perspective of the Federal Highway Administration, but from the U.S. Department of Transportation. We'll tell you what rails with trails are. We'll talk about some policies and perspectives, and then Jared is going to actually get into the substance of the report. And I hope we have question and answer time at the end. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jennifer. So some background. Back in 2002, we put out a first Rails with Trails report. At the time, people were thinking, can these things even be safe? And after 15 years of evidence, we determined that maybe it's time that we updated the report. Well, 15 years became almost 20. We have learned that we can design some best practices or some good practices, design and engineering practices, so that we can have effective practices to promote both railroad safety and trail user safety. Now, this report does not cover all things trails. It doesn't even cover all things rail trails. We're focusing here on rails with trails. And for example, we're not going to get into how wide does a pavement need to be, what does the shoulders need to be, and things like that. So let's go to the next slide, please. Why are we here? Just about a month ago, well, yeah, 5 weeks ago, Federal Highway Administration has its weekly factoids. Every Wednesday, it's the Wednesday, whatever. We put out a weekly factoid. The one in September was about when you see tracks, always think a train. This shows railroad crossing fatalities. In that sense, these are legal highway and rail crossings. They're not related to trail use. But you can see why the railroads do not want people on their tracks. When you have people on their tracks or affected by their trains or bothering their trains, they have the liability issues. They don't want to kill people. The railroads really do care about our safety. So the question that we have is, why are so many people trespassing on railroad property? Because they don't belong there. People are riding horses, they're riding snowmobiles, at least maybe not in Virginia as much, but some are using off-highway vehicles. So we were thinking, well, why are people on railroad property? Most of them just want to get from point A to point B. Most of them see the railroad as potentially a safer route than, say, walking along Fairfax Boulevard, or walking along some major highway, or trying to cross a major highway. It might be easier to cross the railroad. So we figured that probably most people would prefer actually to be on a trail rather than on the tracks, because the trail is usually more comfortable than the tracks. So we also did some research into how many fatalities, how many injuries are there on rail with trails that are attributable to the trail being next to the railroad. And the only documented cases that we could find were actually prior to the 2002 report. And both of them were trail users who were crossing at legal crossings, and they went around the gates or they did other things. So they should not have been on the tracks. So the rails with trails that we have had so far are safe. We can go to the next slide, please. Here are some of the concerns on railroad fatalities. The number has been going up. There were 1,099 railroad trespasser fatalities in 2020. That was an increase. These are people that should not be on the railroad tracks. So can we find a safer way to get these people off the tracks so that they can maybe go along or go across, but not on the tracks? Next slide, please. So what is a rail width trail? It is a shared use path or a trail open and developed for public use that is located on or directly adjacent to an active railroad or rail transit corridor. So some of them are on railroad rights of way, but many of them are not. So a rail width trail can include something like we have here near where I live in Arlington. They have the trail next to the highway, next to the metro. So these are not rails with, these are rails with trails, not rails to trails. There are rail to trail projects, though, that have sections of rails with trails with them. So next slide, please. We have them all over the country. I guess, I think we've actually added either Mississippi or Wyoming since this slide was done. Hawaii doesn't have too many because never had much of a rail system in the first place. But we have rails with trails all over the country. And the number is increasing. And I know that there are several potential here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So let's do the next slide. What are some benefits of rails with trails? Promote active transportation, health and wellness, access. Rail trails can be some of the most accessible trails. They tend to have a relatively flat slope. Economic development we want to support. We want to support environmental protection. Some of the challenges are property acquisition, because the rail may or may not own the adjacent property. It may be somebody else who owns it. The railroads and the trail users are concerned about safety and concerned about liability. And we have concerns about trespassing. Again, I'm going to stress it multiple times. Do not go on active railroad tracks. It is not safe. So let's go to the next slide. We found that many of the railroads actually have written policies against locating trails within the railroad right-of-way. That said, the Class 1 railroads, which are the major railroads, the CSX and the big railroads, they may not want the trail on their property That said, they all have sections of rails with trails on their property. Public transit agencies actually see rails with trails as a potential for getting more access, say to Metro whenever we go back to normal, so we can use Metro. Some state DOTs have policies, some don't. Many of them use the old 2002 study to develop their policies, and we're hoping that more state departments of transportation will use this new guide to develop their own policies. Trail managers, they like rails with trails because they can fill in gaps in their rail networks. But the way they can have to get this done is you have to work closely with all the stakeholders. And Jared will talk about that when we get there. In fact, it is now time for Jared. So I'm going to go back off camera. I'm going to get on mute. And Jared, take it away. Jared's one of my heroes.
Thank you, Jared.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jared Fitchlikowski, a community planner at the USDOT Volpe Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm one of the primary authors of this report, and I am going to be talking about the development process and the design and construction, things that should be considered. Unfortunately, the headings for the slides aren't showing on the screen, so I'll try to read them as we go. This one's on the development process. So the first concept is trying to locate your railroad trail outside of the railroad right-of-way if possible. Again, as Christopher mentioned, sometimes rails with trails are within the right-of-way and sometimes they're outside. The railroad will still be a key stakeholder even if you're outside of their right-of-way. The trail builders will no longer need to acquire the railroad's right-of-way. Instead, try to consider locating the railroad trail on adjacent, possibly publicly owned land. You should also consider doing a feasibility analysis that should address land ownership and acquisition methods, existing physical and environmental conditions, stakeholder engagement, design and construction considerations, trail use and maintenance, and funding mechanisms. Every railroad trail is different, so addressing those questions early in the development process is prudent. For environmental review, you want to be aware and knowledgeable of required state and federal environmental review processes, and if needed, conduct an environmental assessment prior to acquiring land and designing the railroad trail, because you might uncover some things in the environmental review process that you need to address. You want to identify and involve all stakeholders early in the process to address their concerns. Stakeholder groups can include utility companies, transportation, parks and recreation, health departments, law enforcement officials, adjacent landowners, transport user groups, community groups, and the general public. And you also want to engage railroads early and often, including the railroad line operators and freight customers. So it's not just the freight owner, the railroad owner that you're concerned about. You also want to engage any railroads that might use that corridor because they'll be impacted as well. We'll go to the next slide. This covers liability and risk management. Has the slide moved for others? Okay, there we go. So liability and risk management. The Rails to Trails Conservancy, which was one of our big partners for this study, conducted the legal research for our project. And there's several best practices related to that. So you want to conduct your initial legal research early in the process, including ownership, easement, and license agreements in the railroad corridor, legal protections available at the state level, local or state property rights ordinances, and insurance protection. And your legal staff can help with that, your legal team. You also want to gather corridor-specific information about the frequency and location of trespassing on the corridor, the history of injuries sustained by trespassers, and the locations where they occurred, and information about the safety of existing crossings. As Christopher mentioned earlier, safety and trespassing are some of the biggest concerns of railroads. So you should get as much information as you can about trespassing in the corridor so that you can have some data to back up your plans. And the FRA has some resources available online to gather some of that information. You want to be sure to follow the design guide, the design recommendations identified in our report, and also in applicable design guidelines, such as the AASHTO guide for the development of bicycle facilities and the MUTCD as needed. And also consider using indemnification agreements to address liability concerns. Obtain comprehensive liability insurance to cover foreseeable liability costs unless, as a public agency, if it's a public agency developing the railroad trail, they have adequate self-insurance. We'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about regulatory and railroad requirements. So it's important to adhere to all relevant federal, state, and local regulatory requirements, as well as the requirements of the adjacent railroad. This kind of calls back to everything we've been talking about so far on the development process. It's important to note, that, however, that often these requirements are in conflict with one another. So maybe a federal requirement and a state requirement might conflict, or a state requirement and a railroad requirement might conflict. So you want to be aware of these conflicts and prepare to negotiate as you design your railroad trail. Next slide. This starts the series of slides where we'll be talking about some of the design considerations. Just as a note, just to reinforce something Christopher said, this report really talks about all of the elements that are specific to rails with trails and skips everything else that is already covered in all the other rail trail or trail resources out there. So this first one is on setback. So setback is the distance between the trail and the center line of the tracks. Rails with trails should be set back from the railroad tracks as much as possible. There is no national standard for setback, and the report will not provide one. However, we did note a range of 7 to 200 feet with an average setback of about 32 feet. 7 feet, as you can imagine, from the track center line to the edge of the trail is quite close. And you'll see in some of the photos in this presentation that sometimes they are very close. And you might think that's not safe. And so, some might argue, some might agree with you, but that would be in specific cases where the railroad use is not posing a threat to the trail users. Setback determinations should consider various factors, including train speed, frequency, and type, current and future rail maintenance and operations needs, track curvature, topography, and other environmental and physical constraints, the separation type, which I'll talk about next, and any historical patterns of trespassing or vandalism. Again, really important to have that trespassing information. I'll go to the next slide and talk about separation. So separation, so if setback is kind of the horizontal distance between the trail and the tracks, think of separation as the more vertical barrier. So about 87% of rails with trails have some form of separation between the trail and the railroad tracks. Separation between the rail with trail and railroad tracks can be fencing, ditches, berms, and or vegetation. Some railroads might already have fencing in place, as well as vegetation, berms, and ditches. You should work with the railroad to determine if those are adequate or if they need to be enhanced. Keep in mind that those separation facilities were installed before the trail was there, so the presence of the trail may change the needs for that separation. If you're adding vegetation, make sure it doesn't impede the railroad's access for maintenance, and make sure that there's a plan for maintaining the vegetation. And when fencing is needed, corridor characteristics such as the setback distance, location of legal grade crossings, and the type, speed, and frequency of rail service will influence the appropriate fencing style, including height and material. You don't want a fence that's too low, which might invite trespassing, but you also don't want too tall a fence, which might block views and create unsafe areas. You can see in this photo, it's quite an elaborate fence, but hopefully effective at keeping people out. The next slide covers crossings. So about 54% of rails with trails have trail track crossings. New at-grade crossings should only be proposed where there's no other reasonable alternative, just for that same reason that Christopher mentioned for conflicts. Use existing road track crossings where possible. So let's see, in this case, there's an existing crossing with the railroad. Grade crossings should include safety measures such as crossbucks, flashing lights, bells, crossing arms, and signage if appropriate. Those won't all be appropriate for every setting, but that's part of the universe of options. Overcrossings, which are bridges or trestles, or undercrossings, which are basically tunnels of a trail under existing railroad tracks. Avoid the need for at-grade crossings, but they're very expensive to construct and railroads often won't allow them. We'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about bridges and tunnels. So railroad bridges and tunnels can be significant barriers to railroad trail design. As you probably know, bridges and tunnels are expensive, and railroads are generally opposed to sharing existing rail bridges and tunnels with trails, although there are examples of each. Potential solutions for rails with trails on corridors with bridges and tunnels include abutments or cantilevers on existing railroad bridges, although again, some railroads might not be interested in that, or constructing a new bridge or tunnel. And just note that constructing a new structure might be very expensive and have negative environmental impacts. Move on to the next slide. This is about accommodating future tracks and sidings. So rails with trails should be designed and located so as not to preclude potential future rail expansion if expansion is anticipated. You might think, and that's the anticipation of expansion from the railroad's perspective. You might have observed that over the last 30 years, the railroad hasn't grown. If anything, they're shrinking, but the railroad might have plans for expansion, even if it's 50 years down the road, but that's something they're still considering, and you should take that seriously. Where corridor width, topography, and other factors allow, the railroad trail should be located on the opposite side of the proposed track or siding expansion. So again, it doesn't preclude that future expansion. The next slide goes into drainage. So you should consider the impact of the railroad trail and what it might have on the impact it might have on the adjacent rail line's drainage system. In certain cases, a new drainage system might need to be installed to serve both the railroad and the trail. And in this photo, you can imagine that there's definitely some drainage impact from this trail on the tracks. So that would have been considered in the design of the project. The next slide is on construction, operations, and maintenance. So you want to plan for railroad trail construction in close coordination with the railroad owner and operators. Engage the railroads early, not just the railroad, and again, not just the railroad that owns the tracks. You want to have a plan for construction well before construction begins. When engaging in these construction activities, the trail developer will need to satisfy the adjacent railroad's requirements with respect to safety, operations, and the protection of rail facilities. And that will often include the use of flaggers, which are people who are on the tracks during construction, basically giving hand signals to the train operators so that they operate slowly and safely through the construction zone. Trail developers are typically responsible for the cost of flagging services required during trail construction. And that can be a substantial cost. That depends on the number of days that you have construction. So be sure to plan for that early, again, because that's a cost you'll need to consider. Next is operations and maintenance. So you want to coordinate with the railroad owner and operators on the trail and trail and railroad maintenance activities. So keep in mind, you'll be concerned as a trail developer about maintenance on your trail, but you also need to coordinate with the railroad on what their maintenance looks like for their tracks. And sometimes that might include granting them access to your trail to do their own maintenance. You should have a comprehensive operations and management plan that details the procedures and responsibilities for both the railroad and trail manager once the trail's open. In terms of education, you might want to consult the railroad to determine whether trail user education related to the adjacent rail use is necessary. So that could be education about what the railroad line does in terms of what the current operations are, what the history has been, or just general education about railroad safety. In many cases, the presence of a railroad trail channelizes would-be trespassers onto the trail, reducing trespassing and vandalism. But in locations where security remains a concern, consider coordinating with local police to organize activities and trail patrols. You can also plan on clearing vegetation, adding additional lighting, or damage-resistant fencing to address any other safety concerns and security concerns. I just want to note that this is, I happen to live in Milton, Massachusetts, and if you actually just briefly go back to the previous slide, this is the railroad trail that's behind my house, and that's a railroad trail with transit. And yes, At least in the before times, I used to ride a 1945 PCC trolley to work every day. And go on to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Christopher to wrap up.
Thank you, Jared. Let me see. There goes the camera. So to see the whole report, here are the links. It's on the Federal Railroad Administration website. It's on our Federal Highway Administration website. And I see a comment, lots of info like drinking water from a fire hydrant. And we've only just touched the highlights of the report. So it is a rather extensive report. It's, I don't know if people can see my camera in these tiny little boxes. It's that thick. It's a very good report. Has lots of information. Talks about snow. It talks about all kinds of stuff. So I highly recommend that you go look at the report. It should answer a lot of your questions. But with Jennifer, with that, are there any questions that we should take now? I know we're running a little late on our agenda here.
So Lynn, we're about 5 minutes behind. Are there any like general questions, maybe 1 or 2 questions that we can address now? And then, you know, if Christopher, if you or Jared see anything in the chat you'd like to respond to, feel free.
There's only one real question, and that was early on, and it was asking about, could FRA's safety improvements program be tapped for trail crossings or trail separation with rails to trails? And I think those were addressed afterwards. So unless Frank or someone else has more questions on that, I think we're good to go for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know Federal Railroad programs, so I can't talk for them, but I do know that they would be eligible under Federal Aid Highway Program funds through VDOT. And then I do want to point out one thing that we said earlier in our presentation. These rail with trail facilities, as far as we can determine, they promote safety. And when we had a webinar with the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Railroad Administration said these rails with trails, they promote safety. They benefit safety. We are only aware, as far as I know, we are only aware of, I believe, 2 fatalities that were associated with rails with trails. Both of them were at legal crossings of people who were going around the gates or something like that. So it's not the fault of the trail. It's not the fault of the railroad. It's the fault of the human being who made a dumb decision. See, question, public agency get liability if agency's unable. Jared, can you answer the liability question that's in the chat? Do you see that?
How does a public agency get liability insurance if the public agency is unable to obtain this conflict or interest with the agency? I don't have specific advice on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, a lot of our information on liability, due to liability concerns, a lot of liability information is actually not in our report. There is a link to the Rails to Trails Conservancy's information in the report. There's a link to the Rails to Trails Conservancy's information on liability, and that could answer many of your questions.
And we can do some research and try to follow up on some of your questions perhaps in the next meeting. But we need to move on. So I am going to ask our panelists to speak now to some of the Virginia rail trails, some of the successes and challenges. These are all different trails in all different stages of development. First, we have Jim Outland with Canony Atlantic to talk about the Eastern Shore Rail Trail.
Yes, hi, greetings. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is Jim Outland, Canony Atlantic Company, speaking to you from Cape Charles, Virginia. I'm the guy trying to drink water from the fire main here. There's just been some great information coming out, so I really appreciate that, and I look forward to hitting some of these links later. Here, you can advance the slide, please. The Eastern Shore, Virginia, is comprised of 2 counties, Northampton County to the south, Accomack County to the north. Here we have the Eastern Shore Railroad. We have 49 miles of it, which has gone to abandonment status. That goes from Cape Charles in the southern tip up to the small town of Hallwood, which is south of the Maryland line. If you could advance the slide, this trail or this railroad right away is owned by Canoni Atlantic Company, which is a private company. One share is the only share outstanding in that company, and it's owned by the Accomack Northampton Transportation District Commission, which is a political subdivision of the Commonwealth. Our partners at VDOT have completed in early 2021 a very comprehensive feasibility study that's available for anybody that wants to see it by going to VDOT's Hampton Road site. But the corridor is now rail banked under the National Trails Act, and we've kicked off a project to remove all of the rails, ties, and other track material, the signals. That's expected to last 10 months. Canoni Atlantic is managing that project without the needing any of the Commonwealth's help. Our leadership has become, over the past 2 years since the last operator, or coming up on 3 years now, since the last operator ceased operations, we've become very well versed in a lot of the issues, but we're learning every day. And that's where I think this forum has been very helpful to me. Next slide. We're definitely looking to partner with VDOT as concerns an actual build out of a trail or a multi-use path once we have all of the rail removed. So we're hoping for a partnership there. We have over 30 miles of the corridor parallels VDOT's right of way. And so we're hoping that here where the state's resources on the Eastern Shore, that we can leverage those existing resources where we can. We're also hoping that this corridor can help link both state and some federal facilities. DCR has operations here, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service. The Nature Conservancy has been a great partner. And we have a variety of other partners up and down the shore that are very excited about the potential here. Next slide. We have challenges to overcome in an ongoing manner. Resistance. There's a lot of nostalgia for the railroad. It's been here since the 1880s. There are a lot of people that don't want it in their backyard. There's security concerns. Some folks just can't see the economic reality that rail no longer works on the shore. It can't sustain itself without the need for public funds on an ongoing basis. So we are, those are items that will continue to be challenges for us going forward. From what I've read and heard, these aren't necessarily unique challenges to any corridor that's gone through a conversion like this. Of course, we're also trying to rattle the tin cup in search of funding. We're pursuing all avenues there, both with federal, state, and local. A big issue is liability, as y'all touched on right before I started speaking. I've been involved with this corridor as an active rail operation, so we have railroad insurance. And now our railroad insurer is like, well, you're no longer a railroad, we're not going to be able to insure you. So we're going to have to go from being an active railroad insurance to a vacant corridor insurance after the rail is taken up, to then to some sort of recreational multi-use trail insurance. So we're trying to wrap our heads around how we're going to do that. And I'm always open to anybody that has experienced that or has suggestions. In addition, we need to execute our public relations and expectations setting with our citizens. We intend for this to be for the benefit of the citizens of the Eastern Shore of Virginia, all residents of Virginia, as well as tourists. We see this as a potential great economic driver, an ability to link many small towns in our very rural environment here. But we need to communicate with our constituents at the right time, right place, and with the right message. Finally, we're in the process of creating a trail management entity. I'm more on the active operations side, but it would be a sister organization to me. We'd also worked heavily to partner with the Eastern Shore Trail Working Group that we have stood up, which has already done great work for us in creating a rack card, getting public awareness out there, and ongoing work with us in that regard. Finally, next slide, I just leave you with a plug for Peter Harnick's book, From Rails to Trails. Many of you who have been in this world for some time might be very familiar with this. I'm not as familiar with a migration from a rail to a trail. For us, we're doing it once and once only. Mr. Harnick's book is very good in many respects of getting into specifics of, for instance, rural trails and some of the challenges. So I think I've benefited by reading from historically how others have dealt with some of the same issues that I'm seeing. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was a great overview. And I know everybody in this group's really interested in what's happening on the Eastern Shore, so I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Next, we have Jimmy Walters. He's board chair with Tobacco Heritage Trail.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I appreciate being able to join everyone today. This is an overview of the Tobacco Heritage Trail. We comprise 5 different counties and 12 different towns that belong to the Roanoke River Rails to Trails, which is a nonprofit organization. And we have purchased from mostly Norfolk and Southern approximately 140 miles of abandoned railroad that we hope someday to have converted over to really nice rails to trails. You can see the dark brown shows the current portions that are already converted. Total comes up to about 24 miles currently that have been converted from rails to trails. What we found is that if you don't take action in your neighbor's backyard, then they lose interest in trying to help keep things going. So what we're looking at is expanding as much as we can using interim trail design standards. Most of the abandoned railroads are still in good shape. Certainly the hunters get out there and use them driving their ATVs up and down. But if we can go ahead and activate it under an interim trail standard, then it can be used by the pedestrians and people on horseback and joggers, and everyone will feel like they're getting something in return for volunteering and participating. We've been very fortunate in getting organizations to use the trail. The local cancer group in Mecklenburg County just had, I think, their 10th 5K run. The Marine Corps League comes out and does their annual runs. We've had groups come down from Richmond and do marathons because we do have 18 miles of trail that's completed between Lawrenceville and La Crosse. Most of the trail surface is crusher run. We found that that's suitable for both hybrid bicycles as well as joggers and equestrians as we go. Our big challenges really have been maintaining what we've got. And with storms like we had in February, it becomes very difficult to get the trails cleared off in an affordable fashion and do it safely when you've got volunteers out there trying to use their chainsaws locally to take care of things. Besides getting maintenance done and keeping the trails cleared, we're looking at potentially being able to cross the portions of Carr Reservoir down there, which is the largest lake in the state of Virginia. But we've got one bridge that's 170 feet wide, and another bridge that's 120 feet wide. At least that's where the railroad crossings used to be. The concrete trestles are still there, but we need to come up with a way to get across those so we can truly link this corridor together. There is a DoD project where the Department of Defense will provide engineering units to assist local communities. But the local community must have 100% of the materials on hand. I think that VDOT can really assist as they replace bridges in the future. Instead of selling the trestles, the iron girders to scrap metal, donate those to local communities so we can stockpile those and use them for bridging in the future as we go. Again, I've mentioned equestrians. I think we're the only trail that allows carriages on our trail. 2-horse, no problem. If people want to bring a 4-horse unit down, then we ask them to fill out a special permit request so that we can make that information known. We're updating our master plan at this time, and our economic assessment was done in 2006. That probably needs an update as well, so we can hopefully use that as we try to enter the ring for more and more grants. The only other way we get money is the dues from the members and donations from organizations like the American Legion or the local Ruritans. Members that use your trail, remind them of what it does for the community, both physical and mental health, and get them to contribute. Subject to your questions, that's about all I've got right now.
Thank you, Jimmy. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next presenter, and we will come back to questions after all three of you have finished. Jim Lynch.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Jim Lynch with the Dahlgren Railroad Heritage Trail. As it indicated on this map, we're in King George County. The railroad was constructed in World War II to haul ammunition and ordnance into and out of the Navy base at Dahlgren. The eastern part of the line was abandoned in 1990, and it's that eastern part that has become our Dahlgren Railroad Trail, and it was established as a trail in 2006. It is privately owned, but it is open to the public with a no-cost permit. Our goal is to be a part of Caledon State Park, which is on the Potomac River. It's that green shaded area there. The trail does not actually touch the park, but it crosses within a quarter of a mile of it. And a later slide will discuss how we have off-road plans to reach the park. Next slide, Jennifer. So here is a close-up on the western part there. There's a path that's labeled connecting path. We have an arrangement with the owner of that property to establish an easement trail connecting the railroad trail with a trailhead at Caledon Park that's on the road there. And on the eastern end, the county has established a smart scale project for improvements along that stretch of the road, in between where the trail goes under the road, and an east gate of the park. It's called the Hampstead Road Trail gate. We really appreciate the help of the county in that regard. Okay, if I could have the next slide, Jennifer, please. Here's some images of users of the trail. One of the major reasons that I got interested in it is it's a perfect commuting route into the Navy base at Dahlgren, and it is used by a number of commuters. One of the important features of our trail is that we've only cleared the trail out to the width of the original rail bed. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's a rider there riding through what we like to call our tunnel of trees. And the other images around, you can see a wheelchair racer racers that use the trail. We have in the upper left corner winter activities, and probably the most important use of the trail is just local people. Like in the lower left corner, we have a mother and her little daughter out to just having a little run on the trail. Okay, next slide, Jennifer, please. The successes are that we have the trail cleared, and it has been maintained by volunteers for about 16 years. When we acquired the trail, the railroad company had, of course, taken up the rails, but they had not taken up the ties. It took us about 2 years to remove all the ties. We have trail races on the trail that are extremely popular. We're happy that the local county here is extremely supportive. Our friends of the trail and the friends of Caledon have a number of cooperative activities. And in the early days of the trail, is one of our earlier panelists noted, our neighbors on the trail were a little bit hesitant and worried about trespassing and crime and all the usual things you hear about. After about a year, the neighbors realized that hey, nothing's happening here. Everything's great, and the trail neighbors are actually out there using the trail and helping us maintain it. Challenges: parking is limited. We have one large parking lot and two real small ones. Our goal of becoming a part of Caledon hasn't been achieved yet. We are working on connecting paths to Caledon. That's a work in progress. The earlier owner of the trail lost the last mile in the eastern part. So there are other owners of that last mile between the end of our trail and the Navy base. But these owners are trail lovers. So we're hoping we can work out a way that we can complete the last mile. And of course, like most trails, everybody asks, where are the restrooms? So we're working on that. And we're also working on a bypass around a historic minority church cemetery. When the U.S. Navy ran the railroad through the county for all the right engineering.
How much time does he need to do?
Half a minute. We will be, we're working on a bypass. So next slide. Next slide, good. Okay, so to everybody that's here, please come and see us. Take a walk or a ride on the railroad trail. Thank you very much. And that's it.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that overview.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Jennifer.
We have 3 Jims, of course, and so it might get a little confusing asking questions. Hopefully all 3 of you are able to answer some of the questions in the chat bar. Lynn, was there 1 or 2 questions that you think we need to pull forward, or should we go ahead to the next speaker?
Yeah, I think most of them had to do with the rails to trails questions prior. So I would say we can move on to the next speaker.
Okay. So next, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ralph Buehler. He's professor and chair of urban affairs and planning in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech's Research Center in Arlington. Most of his research has an international comparative perspective, contrasting transport and land use policies, transport systems, and travel behavior in Western Europe and North America. We did a lot of benchmarking at our last meeting in May with some of our other states, but we also need to consider benchmarking with other countries, and so I think you're going to enjoy Ralph's presentation. Take it away, Ralph. And you're muted right now.
Thank you. You have to make me a presenter to show the slides.
Yes, I do. Okay.
Okay. There we go. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for those in attendance. I'm presenting today about our new book called Cycling for Sustainable Cities. And this book is a true international collaboration. It's John Pucher and I co-edited it, but there are 45 experts who contributed to this book from 5 continents with expertise in planning, engineering, geography, and public health. And the goal of the book is to explore how to make cycling safe and convenient for everyone. And you can already see here on the title slide a couple of items that are important for the book. It's cycling for men and for women. It's cycling for all ages. It's cycling for all races and ethnicities. And you can see some of the measures that were implemented to make cycling attractive. In the first couple of slides, I'll take you through the chapters of the book, and then I'll dive into some of the content more closely. In the beginning, John Pucher and I give an introduction and an overview with international trends in bicycling, and then we have chapters that focus specifically on important topics on cycling, often written by the experts or some of the experts in the field. The first is on cycling and health. Next one focuses on bicycling safety. Closely connected is chapter 5 on bicycling infrastructure. Next, we have a chapter on bike parking, which is very important because bikes are parked more than they are ridden. The next chapter focuses on non-infrastructure programs and policies that help promote cycling. Chapter 8 looks at the evaluation of different cycling projects and how we prioritize them. Chapters 9 and 10 look at technology and bicycling. First, chapter 9 on e-bikes, and then chapter 10 on bike sharing. The next 4 chapters focus on specific groups of cyclists: women and cycling, followed by children and cycling, and then a chapter on older adults and cycling. And this is sort of bookended by a chapter looking at the importance of equity and social justice in bicycling. Next, we have a couple of case studies, starting with case studies on the 2 most populous countries in the world, China and India, and bicycling there. Then a chapter written on cycling in Latin America. And then a couple of chapters with case studies of cities. First, the mega cities, New York, London, and Paris compared. Next, cycling in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, the 2 big European cycling legacy cities with a long history. And then 2 newcomers, Portland, Oregon, and Seville, Spain, compared and how they implemented pro-bike policies. The second to the last chapter focuses on advocacy in bicycling, and then the last chapter gives an outlook on bicycling and the future. We have sustainability in the title, and that's not by chance. Cycling is one of the very sustainable modes of transport. It's environmentally friendly. There's virtually no pollution at all and a few non-renewable resources. In fact, a new study by Oxford University showed that those who switch just 1 trip per day from car driving to cycling reduced the carbon footprint by about 0.5 tons over a year. Bicycling is also economical compared to the low private cost, but also low public cost compared to building roadways or public transport. We're not against public transport, but the cost is considerably lower for bicycling. It improves health, and this improved health can help reduce medical costs for individuals and for society. It's also socially sustainable. It's affordable for almost everyone. It's physically possible for most. Some may need a special bicycle. And there are many physical, mental, and social health benefits. And we saw some of these mental health benefits also during the COVID pandemic, where many people took to bicycles to be outside and get exercise. So if cycling is so sustainable, well, why is it so low? In the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK, to the left there, this shows the percentage of daily trips made by bicycle. If you go to the right, you see in Europe and in Japan, cycling levels are higher. In the Netherlands, it's 28%. Cycling levels were not always that low in the countries on the left. For the UK, we have data for the 1950s, when they had a bicycling share of trips around 11 or 12%. That's what it is now in Germany. Well, some may think it's trip distance that makes the difference, but that's not fully explaining it. About 40% of trips here in the US are 2 miles or shorter. But this graph here shows you, even when we control for trip distance, the percentage of trips made by bike is low in the US and the UK, even for short trips. And you see there, it's around 2% for trips shorter than a mile or shorter than 2 miles. And if you then look for the trip distance categories and you go to Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands on the right, you see that they are using their bikes for a much higher share of trips, even at longer trip distance categories, but also for shorter trip distance categories. So even controlling for trip distance, the difference in cycling doesn't fully go away. There's good news for bicycling. This shows you about 25 cities in Europe, North, South America, and in Australia, and they all showed increases in bicycling over the last 20, 30 years. We have sort of 2 groups. One group had big increases from very low levels, and some of them are data for the commute. But these are cities like Chicago, Melbourne, New York, Boston. But also if you go here to the right, you see Bogota, Colombia, Portland, Oregon, Vienna, Austria, Seville, Spain. They have increased bicycling from very, very low levels. And then we have a second group of cities that had a lot of cycling already in the 1990s and still have increased them even more. Very impressive there is Frankfurt, Germany, going from 5% to 20%. But also look at Copenhagen and Amsterdam. They had over 20% in 1990, but now they have increased to almost 30% and over 35% of trips. So they have continued to grow their bicycling share. We have an entire chapter written by 3 authors from Bogota, Colombia, on cycling in Latin American cities. And again, there's a huge variability. They are going from almost no bicycling in Quito or in Lima or in Valparaiso to Bogota, Guadalajara on the right with 7 to 8% of trips. There's very little trend data, but for some cities we have trend data for Latin America, and they show substantial increases. Bogota is the one with the strongest increases, about 10-fold, 11-fold, about a 20-year period, but also Santiago de Chile and Buenos Aires have significant increases in their bicycling. Looking around the globe, the trends are not always positive. That's the most negative trend on bicycling we have in the book. That's China. All mega cities, the share of trips by bike over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and the trend is down. The trend is probably even stronger than what we see here because many of these cities include e-bikes in their data, and e-bikes in China are not the pedelecs that we are used to here, but they are typically, they don't even have pedals. They are bikes with a throttle. They're sort of electric scooters. So the actual decline in bicycling is even larger than what we see here. Reasons are many: increasing car ownership, increasing wealth, increasing city size in terms of population, but also geography with longer trip distances, new public transport systems. China has some of the best and largest public transport systems in the world now that all facilitate longer trip distances and less bicycling. The national government is trying to turn this around with new initiatives, but the bicycling kingdom, as China was called, has clearly lost a lot of its bicycling. There is no gender difference in bicycling in China, but most of the bicycling is for utilitarian purposes. We find, on the other hand, big gender differences in Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, where only about a quarter to a third of all bike trips are made by women, which compares then to Austria, Germany, Sweden, with about half of bike trips made by women. And then we have Denmark, the Netherlands, and Japan on the right, where women make the majority of bike trips. So if we want to promote bicycling, we have to promote it for women as well as for men. We also have to promote it for all ages, and we can cycle at all ages. As we see here in the upper center, we have a picture of children with tricycles. At the bottom center, we have an older adult with also with a tricycle. That's then also to transport various items. We can of course cycle for utilitarian purposes or for recreation, as the older adults on the lower right there. Cycling varies by age. We see here for all countries the age group that's not at driving age, the youngest age group, makes the highest share of their trips by bicycle. After that, it drops. In the US and the UK on the left, it keeps dropping, and at older age, we have less than 1% of trips made by bicycle. If we compare that with Japan, where it's sort of stable at 12%, in Germany it's sort of stable at 10% over the age categories. In Denmark it falls, but it's still at 10% for the 70 plus. And then in the Netherlands, we have about 1/4 of all trips made by the 70 plus that are by bicycle. So we can truly keep cycling into older age. We also have a chapter on e-bikes, growth in sales in all countries. Most of the bikes that we have here are pedelecs, so they get electric support when you're pedaling. They come typically in two speed classes, 20 miles per hour and 28 miles per hour. The data end in 2018 here. If we would expand it, we would see even stronger increases, especially during the COVID pandemic in e-bike sales in all of the countries here. The book makes the case that it's crucial to make cycling safe, to make it more attractive. It's especially important for the young, the old, anyone with disabilities, the timid or the risk averse. Most studies show that on average, women are more sensitive to safety than men. And in many ways, the greater cycling safety in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany can help explain higher cycling levels there. And this shows you a comparison of the cyclist fatality rate per 100 million kilometers cycled over 3 time periods, 2000, 2008, and 2016. And it's adjusted for million kilometers cycled. What we see here is that the UK, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands have improved their cycling safety over the time period significantly in some instances, and the Netherlands and Denmark has of the safest cycling. In the US, we were headed in the right direction between 2000 and 2002, but then the US rebounded, and the cyclist safety, the cyclist fatality rate got higher. And the question is, of course, why that happened, and we try to explore that, but there's not one reason, there are many different reasons. It's increasing vehicle miles traveled, increasingly larger vehicles, distraction, at least compared to the European countries, greater distraction of drivers, less enforcement of distraction, more drunk driving. In spite of having a higher blood alcohol level that's allowed in the US, the share of crashes with drunk driving was higher than in Europe at a lower level. And it was sort of a whole group of factors, but not one single factor that stood out. But clearly headed in the wrong direction here in the US, the trends for the fatality rate of cycling. So how can we encourage cycling while we improve its safety? Key measures are better cycling facilities and traffic calming of residential neighborhoods, but also mixed-use zoning, improved urban design to keep trip distances short enough, integration of cycling with public transport for longer trip distances, restrictions on motor vehicle use. This means speed, but also access, improved traffic education for both motorists and cyclists, traffic regulations that protect cyclists and enforcement of those, and of course special events and promotional campaigns, etc. Here's some pictures of these so-called cycle tracks or protected bike lanes. They look different in different countries. Many cities are building networks of those. The one in Copenhagen on the upper left, if you look in the back, you see a little curb there separating the drivers from the cyclists. There would be another curb separating the cyclists from the pedestrians, and then it's carried through the intersection on that blue color. On the upper right, you have Bogota, Colombia. They're using these orange or yellow caps here to separate the two-way cycle track. Montreal, the North American city with the oldest network of these cycle tracks, they're using these concrete walls. And on the lower right in Seville, Spain, they're using a fence. One new, not infrastructure, but one new concept we came across were these so-called bicycle expressways. These are examples in various places. They typically connect the hinterlands to the city. Some of them run through the city. And what they do is they separate cyclists from pedestrians. And then more importantly, at intersections with roadways, they either have a bridge or they have a tunnel. And what that does is two things. At least two things. One is it speeds up cycling because you don't have to wait at the intersection. And two, it removes the danger of crossing that section. On the lower picture here in Beijing, China, this is an elevated bicycle expressway that's above the city. Again, one of these measures to bring bicycling back. We also see a trend towards a focus on intersection safety now, away from just focusing on the links of the network. This is a shot from Salt Lake City, actually, where a Dutch-style protected intersection was imported. And essentially, these what we dubbed safety islands sort of help explain how they work. They force motorists to travel into the intersection and then make a turn there at a slower speed. This allows them to see cyclists for a longer period of time, and if there is a collision, for the collision to be at lower speed and or can be avoided altogether. It also narrows the crossing distance for the cyclist going across, and then once across they can continue straight, or they queue again here to make a two-step turn to complete their left turn. Many cities, especially in the Netherlands, have entire networks of these bike paths and lanes. This is Amsterdam. And what you see in red is all bike paths and lanes. In orange, you see the future bike paths and lanes. And of course, in addition to that, you have traffic calm neighborhood streets where traffic speed is low and volumes are low and cyclists can share. But keep in mind that cycling has not always been that way in Amsterdam. That's the 1970s when cycling was in free fall, and you see that Amsterdam, like most countries, went the motorization route. Bikes are pushed to the side on the picture on the left, and the space is given to cars. Today, on the right, this street is a bicycle street where cycling is prioritized in the city, and there's some deliveries that are allowed there, but in general, this is a street for bicyclists and pedestrians on the side. A similar example, this time from Germany, sort of showing how cities had adapted to the car. This is 1950s. We have a car there, we have some bikes, we have a trolley running, and we have a fountain. And the fountain is marked for a reason, because due to urban renewal, there's the fountain. This intersection and the city was redesigned to be a city for cars. And bicyclists, pedestrians are pushed to the side. And this is a postcard. The city thought it's so great what they achieved. They put this on a postcard and they colored it. Ironically, on the left there, the little boy or girl is almost hit by that Volkswagen or Porsche. But the point is, all planning went went towards the automobile. Again, today, there's the fountain. This place, the building is still there, but this place is a place where only pedestrians and cyclists can share, and car traffic is not allowed. Again, a redesign of the city and the thoughts around planning. In neighborhoods, traffic calming is very important. This is from the World Health Organization, showing the impact on a pedestrian hit at a certain speed by a vehicle and the likelihood of a fatal injury. Starts sort of increasing exponentially around 30 kilometers per hour. That's where a lot of their speed limits are in cities and in neighborhoods. In the US, we often use 25 miles per hour, or we use 35 miles per hour. And according to this graph, we're way too high for these, at least in residential or in city areas. There are many other policies that help promote bicycling other than traffic calming and infrastructure. For example, bike transit integration. That's typically done as on the upper right, and bikes on buses. About 85% of buses in the US, I think, now have these bike racks. On the lower left, as we see there from Vancouver, that bikes on certain times are allowed in certain cars on rail vehicles. Or bikes are parked at transit stations, as we see in DC, in Freiburg, and in Groningen. Protects the bikes from the weather, and often when it's for pay, it also includes surveillance to protect the bikes from theft. Bike parking is important in the city, of course, as well, as we see there in Portland at the bottom with the bike parking corrals that replace 2 car parking spots, and computerized bike parking in Nagoya, Japan, where you enter your bike into this machine that either goes up or down and stores your bike, and you can retrieve it. Many other policies include ciclovías. These are events where roadways are closed for cars and given over to pedestrians, cyclists, inline skaters for hours, a day, a weekend, weeks, etc., and gives people a sense of what the space could be like if we wouldn't use it for motorized vehicles. Bike sharing has been quite successful in attracting different people to cycling, especially those who don't want to worry about theft or don't want to worry about repair or maintenance, those who live in apartments and don't have space to store bicyclists, of course, tourists. Many companies have bike to work day events where they try to entice employees to bike to work, and then of course keep doing it. And there are also many other programs like that. Bike to school days exist as well. Bike training is important for children. In most US states, this is voluntary. In DC, but also in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, kids learn to cycle in school as part of the curriculum, first in the classroom, then on a traffic garden, and then they are taken out into the real world to cycle. Bike training for adults is very important, especially in countries with low cycling levels. Adults may not have ridden in a long time, and they may not feel comfortable riding a bike, and they want to learn again how to ride a bike and the rules of the road, etc. Training motorists, of course, is also important, that they know how to behave around cyclists and pedestrians, avoid hitting them, and avoid endangering them. That should be part of the motorist training. Many cities have set up these so-called bicycle accounts, where they benchmark bicycling indicators. It could be a bikeway network length, it could be condition of the bikeway network, it could be cycling levels, it could be cyclist safety, etc. And they're tracking these efforts over time and then benchmark themselves where they are now, where they were, and where they want to go. Very briefly, in closing, in the book, we make the point that it's important to implement safe cycling infrastructure, but there is a need for an integrated package of programs and policies that complement these bikeways, that include parking, land use, traffic calming, enforcement, education, integration with transit and wayfinding, and push factors for drivers that can be beneficial for cyclists, like speed limits in neighborhoods, for example. And that combined with pull factors for bikes seems to be most successful. Lastly, cycling should be for everyone. So it's important to think of equity on all groups when we design infrastructure and when we think about bicycling cultures. Planning processes should prioritize the inclusion of all groups, especially disadvantaged groups, at every stage to get their thoughts into the planning process when we are building these. I leave you with a cover of the book that shows true mass cycling in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. That's sort of daily cycling. There are people in everyday clothes riding relatively normal bikes, and a green light for bicycles there on the traffic signal. Now I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if there are any, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Lynn, while I am resetting my slideshow, can you bring some questions forward?
Yeah, the only question we have at this time is, are there any thoughts about maximum elevation range in cities that might or might not create a ceiling for participation in cycling? That was from Andrew Downs. So I don't know if Ralph, you want to talk to that?
Sorry, I was out. I clicked the wrong button. I had to come back.
All right. So the question was, are there any thoughts about how the maximum elevation range in cities might or might not create a ceiling for participation in cycling?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that in particular in the chapter, but elevation is a deterrent to cycling, especially if you have to go up and down the hills. The e-bikes tend to help overcome that. Now there is not that much research on them, but e-bikes can help overcome the elevation issue. There's of course also cities that work around it, like in San Francisco. I remember cycling there with the bike planners. They have something, I think they call it the wiggle, where essentially you're sort of making your way on bike infrastructure around the foothills of their steep hills. So they are routing the routes not to go over or to go down again. But elevation changes can be a deterrent. But e-bikes may be helpful to overcome that.
Yeah. And then there's the question, does the book include guidance as to when to implement bicycle expressways versus cycle tracks?
No, it's not an engineering manual that way. We have a chapter from Peter Firth who writes about protected bike lanes and other infrastructure, but there's no guidance on the expressway versus doing something else. And one issue with the bike expressways is that it's sort of a new category that's coming up, but it's not really its own infrastructure category. Very often cities are using different types of other infrastructure that they are designating as a bike expressway along the route. There's actually been quite some debate also with our book authors on these expressways and what exactly an expressway is. And often it's taking other infrastructure that already exists, maybe adding a bridge, adding a tunnel, and stitching it together to call it an expressway.
Thank you. The other comments have a conversation about elevations of cities, you know, how high they are and what that means for cycling. But I would guess people who live in those cities to cycle in those cities isn't a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, so now I understand. I thought the overall elevation. I haven't seen any research on that. There are conferences on winter cycling, but I have not seen anything special on elevation on cycling. I'm sorry.
That's okay. All right, I think that's pretty much it. There was a compliment to a great presentation. People looking forward to reading your book. And thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you for having me, and I apologize for pressing the wrong button. That threw me out of the meeting.
No worries.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We really enjoyed that. So next up, we have Ronnie Day. We have a series of updates. She's going to provide an update on the Intermobility Planning and Investment Report.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I realize time is not on our side. I'm looking at the clock and what time the meeting's supposed to run until. So I will provide a quick update. For a benefit of the group, OIPI was asked to coordinate a multi-use trails policy working group. That working group was supposed to evaluate and recommend a prioritization process for the identification of new multi-use trail opportunities, master planning process, prioritization, as I mentioned earlier, and a funding need assessment. The group is made up of transportation, as well as DRPT. I believe you all heard from Emily earlier, staff from House Appropriations and Senate Finance, as well as DCR. Both Jennifer and Kelly are sitting on the work group, and I may have forgotten a few people. So I do apologize if I did. And then we've got some folks from my office that are also participating. We decided to seek out consultant support to help us pull together the report and recommendations. So Cambridge Systematics is our consultant that's helping with this. We have had 3 meetings. The first meeting, the work group really focused on leveling set everyone as far as what the charge was to the group and understanding what the differences are between DCR and the trails that they maintain, and then VDOT's responsibilities. Our second meeting, we actually asked 3 organizations to come in and present to the group. And those organizations included League of American Bicyclists, East Coast Greenway, and the Capitol Trails Coalition. The Cambridge team also reached out and conducted some stakeholder and practitioner interviews. And I believe Kat Anthony's following me. She was one of those folks that Cambridge reached out to. And then our most recent meeting, we talked about considerations for master planning as well as prioritization. Should we look at existing funding programs or look at creating some new ones, and also the funding needs assessment. I'm certainly happy to share any of the presentations that Cambridge shared with the work group with you all. If you want to send me a request, and I'll definitely dump my email address into the chat box. Cambridge Systematics will be presenting actually to you all. I believe Jennifer is going to send out an invitation for November the 16th for those of you who are able to join, and they will provide a high-level overview of what will be contained in the final report. So it will be a draft that you all will be receiving information on. And then following that, the work group will be meeting a final time and are on track for early final submission in December. I do want to, while I have the opportunity here, just to go ahead and answer one question, because I've received the question several times, and it's, what about the money? So there is $10 million that has also been set aside in the budget. The Commonwealth Transportation Board is the one, or the group rather, that will be making decisions on the use of that funds. Presently, I do believe that they are waiting to see what comes out of the recommendations from this report to decide on how to proceed. So I do want to at least answer that question. There's more to come on that. There has not been an established process for the 10 million. So I do expect that that will be following this, and more than likely it'll be early next year, given that the report will be submitted to both House Appropriations and Senate Finance Committees in December. So with that, I will stop. I'll put again my email address in the chat box, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I just want to be respectful of the time that's remaining in the meeting. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ronique. Yes, we've got about less than 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask, we'll follow up separately with Ronique. And again, all the questions that have come into the chat, we'll try to respond to in the notes or individually. And I'm going to invite Kat Anthony to come on and give an update for the Virginia Trails Alliance.
Thank you. And yes, I'll be brief as well, because I know 3 o'clock is approaching very quickly. And so my name is Kat Anthony. I'm the president of the Virginia Trails Alliance. And so if you don't know about VTA, it is a coalition of organizations, businesses, and individuals who are advocating for trails. That 10 million that was in the General Assembly, that was one of the things that we advocated for, is increased funding for trails. And so we were very excited to see that. So just brief updates, things that we've been up to. We published in partnership with the Virginia Conservation Network, increasing support for trails, a VCN paper. Also worked on an access paper to encourage access for all to green spaces and trails. We've also been trying to do more outdoor caucus meetings and making sure the legislation knows that both trails and green spaces, we're here. We have voices and we want to be heard. And so I hope to have more meetings in the coming months. Also working on with a number of groups, a dedicated funding coalition, which is advocating for trail funding, conservation, and many other great causes. And so if you have any questions about those, send me an email. I'll put my email address in there. But if you want to get more involved, just send me an email. We can get more involved. So thank you, and keep up with the good work. There's so much great work happening in Virginia. So thank you.
Sorry about that slide advance. That was not a hint. That was an accident. But thank you, Kat. Appreciate that update. And we'll move quickly to David Brickley, who's going to talk about the September 11th National Memorial Trail.
Hey, thanks. Can you put the slide on showing the route of the 9/11? Great. On the 13th of this month, after 20-year quest, which started at a meeting that DCR chaired, multi-state governors conference on greenways, trails, and green infrastructure. We had a bill signing with President Biden signing the legislation providing for federal designation of the 1,300-mile September 11th National Memorial Trail, which you see in front of you right now. It is a multi-use trail. When it's finally completed, of which 50% is off-road right now, there is a companion driving trail. The idea was to have a trail of remembrance to honor those who gave their all on September the 11th of 2001, and now 20 years later, it has come into fruition. We had fantastic support from our congressional delegations. It is one of the few votes that I know of that literally was passed unanimously by the House of Representatives and then unanimously by the United States Senate. Wouldn't we like that to happen with a lot of things? I've tried to keep my 5 minutes to about a minute and a half, so you don't have a problem with time as much as you will otherwise. And again, this is a Virginia project. That's just some of the connections that we work with in Virginia. It's the Potomac, the Mount Vernon Trail, Arlington National Cemetery, the C&O Canal, going on. It's a great project, and be more than glad to provide any additional information that you'd like to have, or go to our website, www.911trail.org, 911trail.org. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you, David, and congratulations for the recent federal designation. I know you've worked so hard on that trail.
Been a labor of love. Thanks.
Next, we have two staff members from the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. First, we have Debbie Spiliotopoulos, who's going to update us on the Potomac Heritage Trail Equity and Economic Impact Study. Debbie?
Hey, everybody. I know we're running late. I'm just here to let you all know that we finished, or we've gotten to the point with our consultant that we have some draft results, and we're seeking feedback on Thursday in a call to go over them. This is an equity, health, benefits, transportation, economic benefits study that was done for the Potomac Heritage Trail, Northern Virginia. But the method, I'm realized I don't have my, now can you see me? Sorry about that. It's basically just for Northern Virginia sections of the Heritage Trail. And just some teasers. It included focus groups, overlays of a number of different issues, and a lot of data resources. And some of the teasers that we have is that it did show that socially vulnerable communities were disproportionately provided less access to the Heritage Trail than other communities. That the average number of users is 100,000 per mile of trail annually. And that with we did two case studies, and the Neabsco Creek Boardwalk, which was a completed case study, which is beautiful if you guys are ever up here. And David Brickley was pretty involved in that. So thank you, David. And as well as Prince William County. Their usage when they opened this recreational boardwalk, it was over 2 times the average amount of usage, and it was for that portion of the Heritage Trail. So find out more in more detail soon. And thank you, Lynn, for putting the notice in the chat if you all want to get on there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Debbie. They contracted with BBC Consulting out of Colorado. They've done a lot of these studies around the country, and they did also an informational webinar that explained how they derived their figures, which was very interesting. So I hope you can tune into that on October 28th. Okay,
right.
Colton.
And the only thing I want to follow up with is we will have the final report out at the end of the month. And I think we'll have a presentation and we'll have it available then that we can promote. And thanks also to Virginia Department of Health for having Equitable Cities run the focus groups.
Thank you, Debbie. And Corey's going to share what Prince William County has been doing for the Potomac Heritage Trail, but also the other trails in their county. If you're there, you're muted.
Now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Jennifer just asked us to comment briefly on the aspirational trails map, which is an effort led by the Greater Prince William Trails Coalition, because it's a very unique planning tool that they've been developing, and NVRC has been involved in the collaboration of it. But basically, the Greater Prince William Trails Coalition is a collaboration of public and private organizations and citizen volunteers, all working to advance the completion of an interconnected trail network throughout the county and the independent cities and towns within. They just came to the conclusion eventually that if they don't ask for trails in a specific and constructive way with segments identified, that you don't get the trails built as fast and in the sequence that you might think is the best. So they created this aspirational trails map, which is sort of like a crowdsourced trails map, which people can go in to the map and sort of just click on different or add segments of where they think specific trails should go, and fill out some attributes about that. So the aspirational trails map as it stands now is basically a proposal of trails that could be built in the next 20, 30 years in the Prince William County area. So it's a pretty neat tool, and they feel like it's the first step to implement the vision of the Greater Prince William Trails Coalition, to provide more of a connected and multimodal trail system throughout the county. And this is it's a first step towards getting a better trails network included in comprehensive plans, followed by inclusion in capital improvement plans and authorization and annual budgets. So if you have an opportunity, I've included the links on the slide. Go check it out, as well as the Greater Prince William Trails Coalition. The folks involved in the coalition have been very proactive and professional about getting these lines on the map, and hoping that in the future they become a little bit more connected with the trail network.
Thank you, Corey. And Ann's put a note in there about the National Park Service facilitating that planning effort. We're going to move to Paul Gilbert. Now, I know there's a lot more going on in Northern Virginia than we could capture in this update. So please, if you're on the line and you have an update, type it into the chat. That way it'll make it into the minutes. Paul?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll be really quick because we don't have much time. About 2 weeks ago, this picture was taken. It's at the dedication of a new section of the WNOD where we've rebuilt it. We call this dual trails. There is a cycling trail, a 2-foot median with stained asphalt that looks like brick, and then a pedestrian trail. The project is also a lot bigger than just a trail surface. Complete stormwater project with swales and French drains and a interesting feature called a modular wetland. Anyway, the project is only about 1.5 miles. It cost $3.4 million, and it was funded with transportation money because the trail in this area is so heavily used. And we really view this as a model for urban areas along the WNOD going forward, that we're going to have more and more of these, and hopefully a model for many other communities that have very congested trail areas.
Thank you, Paul. I agree. I think this is a great model looking forward into the future. So be sure and find out more about that project if you have a chance. I'm going to move on to DCR updates. The Agritourism Conference, just very briefly, we had about 100 attendees. It was a 4-day conference. There was a fee of $100 or $75 if you pre-registered. So that may have discouraged people. Unfortunately, I think we only had 3 or 4 people from the State Trails Advisory Committee that participated in that. We are going to have some regional VOP meetings. We're in the thick of that right now, and I will send out as a follow-up a schedule of those meetings with the links to register. Those are held in each of the regions. And I'm going to turn it over to Crystal.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you hear me? I just wanted to provide a quick update. You know, we've had a lot of grant rounds this year that were successful. The Recreational Trails Program, we have now launched 10 new projects. It was very competitive. We thank everybody that participated, and we hope that in the future we can have additional funding for the Rec Trails Program, but that's all wrapped up in the infrastructure bill, and I'll, you know, stay informed about that. The new Trail Access Program, we are launching 4 projects for that as well with state funds. The Land and Water Conservation Fund update for the moment is that we are tentatively planning to have the open grant round state formula this coming January to March for the opening of it. So we are working with the National Park Service, and that will be open for acquisition, development, and combination projects. So we're modifying our manual. You can look at our website, but please do email us. I'll drop the email to send that to, but email us if you are not on our list, and we will update you when we have outreach and update opportunities. Thank you.
And we are at the 3 o'clock hour. So if you have ideas for topics for the next meeting, just email them to me. I also saw a bunch of ideas in the chat, which I will try to pull. And I thank you all for your attendance today. I don't know, Kelly, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we adjourn?
I just want to thank everyone for your attendance today. It was a filled agenda today, and I appreciate Jennifer for putting it together. Every time I sit through one of these, I hear more and more topics that I haven't heard before, so I appreciate the mixture of items that gets presented every time, and I appreciate all the speakers that spoke today and your time today. Thank you very much for attending.
And thanks to John Bolchek. We combined this with the Bike Pedestrian Advisory Committee meeting that was held this morning, so that some of you have been on the call for the whole day, and I know that that's a real gift of your time. So thank you. Bye-bye.